In the summer of 1964, America told itself a new story. On July 2nd, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, and on paper, segregation was finished, discrimination was illegal, and black Americans were finally guaranteed equal treatment in public spaces. Restaurants, hotels, theaters, and retail stores were now required by federal law to serve customers regardless of race. Newspapers called it a turning point, politicians called it progress, and white America congratulated itself for finally doing the right thing. But laws have a habit of changing faster than people, and nowhere was that gap more obvious than in Manhattan's most exclusive shopping district. Fifth Avenue in 1964 was still an unofficial fortress of white wealth. Luxury boutiques lined the street like guarded castles, filled with unspoken rules about who belonged and who did not. No sign said "whites only" anymore, but the message was delivered through cold stares, delayed service, whispered insults, and subtle humiliation. Black customers were technically allowed inside, but many were made to feel like intruders, like they were trespassing in a world that wasn't meant for them. Wealthy white elites believed the Civil Rights Act was something that applied to the South, to buses in Alabama, to lunch counters in Mississippi, not to them, not to their stores, not to their neighborhoods. In their minds, money still made the rules, and their money made them untouchable. That belief created a dangerous arrogance, an assumption that the law could be ignored if you had the right last name, the right connections, and enough influence to make problems disappear. The law said black Americans were equal, but Fifth Avenue hadn't gotten the memo. And for men like Charles Whitfield Peyton III, October 1964 still felt like 1954, a time when a wealthy white man could insult, humiliate, and dehumanize black people in public without consequence. That illusion of immunity, that belief that power meant freedom from accountability, was exactly what made the events of October 10th so explosive, because when that illusion finally shattered, it didn't just expose one man's racism, it exposed how fragile white elite power had become in a changing America. They didn't walk in angry, they didn't walk in loud, and they didn't walk in looking for a confrontation. On that October afternoon in 1964, Mae Johnson and her daughter Ruthie stepped onto Fifth Avenue with the quiet confidence of women who knew exactly who they were. Their posture was composed, their clothing was elegant, and nothing about them suggested protest or rebellion. They weren't there to challenge the system. They weren't there to prove a point. They were there for the most ordinary reason imaginable. They walked in to shop. Mae Johnson moved with the ease of someone accustomed to respect, a woman who had navigated elite spaces before and understood their unspoken rhythms. Ruthie followed beside her, young, observant, and learning, absorbing how dignity was carried without words. There was no hesitation at the door, no pause to scan the room for approval, no need to announce themselves. They belonged there as much as anyone else inside that boutique, and they carried themselves accordingly. The store was quiet, refined, and heavy with expectation. Mannequins stood frozen in expensive dresses. Mirrors reflected polished floors and carefully curated luxury. For white customers, it was a sanctuary, a place designed to affirm status and comfort. For black customers, it was often a test, a space where presence alone could feel like an act of defiance. But Mae and Ruthie did not treat it that way. They browsed calmly, touched the fabric, exchanged soft opinions, and behaved exactly as paying customers were meant to behave, nothing more, nothing less. That calm was its own kind of power. They didn't shrink, and they didn't overcompensate. They didn't ask for permission to be there, and they didn't apologize for their presence. Their elegance wasn't performative. It was natural. Their confidence wasn't loud. It was settled. And in a place like Fifth Avenue, where status was everything, that quiet assurance was unsettling to those who believed certain spaces were still reserved for certain people. They weren't activists in that moment. They weren't symbols, and they weren't trying to represent a movement. They were simply a mother and daughter, enjoying an afternoon in a city that legally promised them equality, and that was precisely what made their presence so threatening to men who still lived by older rules. Because when black women walked into spaces like that without fear, without hesitation, and without asking to be tolerated, it challenged an entire social order. It said, without speaking, that the world had changed, whether some people were ready for it or not. Charles Whitfield. Peyton III was not a man accustomed to being challenged, especially not in public, and certainly not by people he had spent his entire life believing were beneath him. He was born into generational wealth, the kind that didn't need to explain itself, the kind that came with private schools, inherited connections, and a last name that opened doors without questions. His family fortune wasn't built overnight, and it wasn't built fairly. It was accumulated through decades of exclusion, preferential contracts, segregated markets, and an economic system that rewarded men who knew how to keep certain people out while keeping profits in. Peyton didn't see himself as racist. Men like him never did. He saw himself as a guardian of tradition, of standards, of how things were supposed to be. In his mind, Fifth Avenue wasn't just a shopping district. It was a sanctuary for people like him, a space designed to reinforce hierarchy, to separate those who belonged from those who were merely allowed to pass through. The Civil Rights Act didn't change that belief. It only threatened it, because laws could force access, but they couldn't force acceptance. When Peyton saw May and Ruthie Johnson in that boutique, what he felt wasn't simple anger. It was something deeper, more personal. It was the sensation of a world slipping out of alignment. For the first time, the rules he had inherited no longer protected him the way they used to. Equality. Standing calmly in front of him, dressed well, composed, and unafraid, felt like an invasion. To Peyton, equality felt like theft. That feeling cracked something inside him. His rage wasn't spontaneous, and it wasn't uncontrollable. It was entitlement colliding with reality. A belief system built on dominance doesn't fade quietly. It lashes out. And in that moment, Peyton wasn't defending a store, or a dress, or even his own reputation. He was defending an old order, one where wealth came with unquestioned authority, and where black presence in white spaces required permission. What Peyton didn't realize, what men like him rarely did, was that power was changing shape. The same system that once shielded him was now full of cracks. His money still mattered, but it no longer guaranteed silence, obedience, or immunity. And by choosing to act on his entitlement that afternoon, he didn't preserve his power. He exposed how fragile it had already become. What happened next wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Charles Whitfield Peyton III didn't shout across the room. He didn't cause a scene the way movies like to show. Instead, he walked closer, invaded their space, and let his contempt do the talking. His words were sharp, loaded, and unmistakable, even without being quoted. They carried the weight of slurs that had been used for generations, the kind that didn't need to be spoken clearly to be understood. Every syllable was meant to remind them of where he believed they belonged. The humiliation was public, and that was the point. He didn't pull a clerk aside. He didn't whisper his objection. He wanted the room to hear, to see, to understand who still held authority in that space. And when he reached for the dress, when he yanked it from May Johnson's hands, the act wasn't accidental. It was symbolic violence. A message delivered through fabric and force, saying this was not theirs to touch, not theirs to claim, not theirs to buy. The dress didn't just fall to the floor. It was thrown, stripped of dignity the same way he was trying to strip them of theirs. The store froze. Conversation stopped. Footsteps paused, and eyes turned toward the moment without moving closer. Clerks stood still. Customers pretended to browse, and management disappeared into silence. The room filled with a thick, suffocating stillness. The kind that follows cruelty when no one wants to be responsible for stopping it. Nobody stopped him. Nobody defended them. That silence did more damage than the words. Because silence is how cruelty becomes normal. Every person who looked away made a choice, and every choice added weight to the insult. The humiliation wasn't just coming from Peyton anymore. It was coming from the entire room, from the people who benefited from the rules, and from those too afraid to challenge them. In that moment, May and Ruthie weren't just facing one man's hatred. They were facing a system that relied on quiet cooperation to survive. Ruthie felt it immediately. The shock, the confusion, the realization that dignity alone wasn't enough to protect you. May understood it too, but she carried it differently. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach back for the dress. And she didn't give Peyton the reaction he wanted. Instead, she stood still, composed, absorbing the moment without surrendering herself to it. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. Because public humiliation only works when it destroys the person being humiliated. And Peyton failed at that. He embarrassed them, but he didn't break them. What he didn't see, what no one in that room understood yet, was that the line he had just crossed couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't just an insult anymore. It was a declaration. And declarations, especially cruel ones, have consequences. Mae Johnson was the first to move. Not in anger, not in retreat, but with intention. She reached for her daughter's hand, steady, unshaken, and turned toward the exit without saying a word. There was no argument, no demand for justice, no attempt to reclaim the dress that had been thrown to the floor. The silence she chose was not submission. It was control. Ruthie followed her mother, heart racing, eyes burning, carrying a confusion she didn't yet have the language for. She didn't understand how something so small could feel so heavy, or how a room full of adults could watch and do nothing. But she understood one thing clearly. Her mother was not going to let that moment define them. They walked past the mirrors, past the clerks, past the customers who refused to meet their eyes. Each step was measured, composed, and deliberate. No one stopped them. No one apologized. No one tried to explain. The door opened. The noise of Fifth Avenue rushed back in, and the world continued as if nothing had happened. That was the cruelest part. For everyone else, it was just another afternoon. For Mae and Ruthie, it was a moment that would follow them home. They didn't win that moment, but they didn't lose themselves either. They left with their dignity intact, their posture unbroken, and their humanity untouched by the ugliness they had just been handed. And sometimes, in a world designed to strip people of both, that quiet refusal to be diminished is its own kind of victory. That evening, the story was told quietly. No raised voices, no dramatics, no need to exaggerate what had already cut deep. Mae spoke first, choosing her words carefully, not to protect the man who insulted them, but to protect her daughter from reliving every detail. Ruthie listened. Eyes lowered, hands clenched, as the weight of the afternoon finally found a place to land. When the sentence came out, when she said what he had called them, the room went still. Daddy. He called us animals. Bumpy Johnson didn't react the way most men would have. There was no shouting, no pacing, no vow of immediate violence. He didn't curse. He didn't threaten. And he didn't raise his voice. He sat quietly, absorbing every word, every pause, every unspoken detail. He understood something important in that moment. This wasn't just an insult. It was a message, a reminder of how the world still treated black women when it thought no one powerful was watching. When Mae finished, Bumpy didn't ask how angry they were, or how embarrassed, or how afraid. He asked one question, calm, precise, and deliberate. Did you get his name? That question carried weight, because names mattered to Bumpy Johnson. Names meant leverage, records, connections, and consequences. Violence was easy. What took skill was making sure the lesson lasted. When the name was given, Bumpy nodded once. No speech followed, no reassurance. Just 4 words delivered without emotion. I'll handle it. That sentence was terrifying, because it wasn't a threat. Threats announce themselves. They warn you, give you time to prepare, to hide, to push back. Bumpy's words did none of that. They promised action without noise, consequence without spectacle, and justice without witnesses. People who knew Bumpy understood what those words meant. They meant the problem was already being solved. There would be no public retaliation, no headlines the next morning, and no visible sign of anger. But somewhere, in offices and boardrooms and private conversations, pressure would begin to build. And the man who believed he had just humiliated 2 women without consequence had no idea that his world was already starting to close in. What followed over the next 72 hours didn't look like revenge. There were no phone calls filled with threats, no men waiting in shadows, no broken windows or whispered warnings. On the surface, nothing happened at all. And that was the first mistake Charles Whitfield Peton III made. He assumed silence meant safety. He assumed the absence of violence meant the absence of consequence. Bumpy Johnson understood something most powerful men never did. Chaos attracts attention. Quiet control creates outcomes. Instead of acting emotionally, he moved strategically. The first conversations weren't about anger. They were about records, partnerships, and exposure. Bumpy didn't need to invent pressure. He knew exactly where it already existed. Banks were the first lever. Peton's empire wasn't built on cash alone. It was built on trust, credit, and reputation. Bumpy knew which institutions quietly backed Peton's ventures, which loans depended on clean optics, and which investors couldn't afford to be associated with public racial scandal in a post-Civil Rights Act America. Quiet questions were asked, not accusations, just questions about compliance, about liability, about risk. In 1964, those questions carried weight. At the same time, civil rights organizations began to hear familiar names, not shouted, not leaked, but delivered through proper channels. Documentation, eyewitness accounts, and legal language replaced outrage. This wasn't a street complaint. It was a civil rights violation, occurring months after federal law had changed. The timing mattered. The law was new, the nation was watching, and no institution wanted to be seen testing its limits. Media pressure didn't arrive as a headline, it arrived as possibility. Editors were informed, carefully, that a prominent Fifth Avenue businessman might soon become a symbol of northern hypocrisy. No stories were printed yet. They didn't need to be. The threat of exposure in a changing America was more powerful than ink. Advertisers worried. Boards asked questions. Allies began to distance themselves. Every move was legal. Every step stayed within the system. There were no bribes, no intimidation, and no crimes. Bumpy didn't break the law. He weaponized it. He used the very structure men like Peton believed existed to protect them. The same laws they dismissed as symbolic, the same regulations they assumed would never reach their doors, were now pointed directly at their balance sheets. By the second day, the pressure became visible. Phone calls stopped being returned, meetings were postponed, credit lines were reviewed, language changed. Words like temporarily and out of an abundance of caution began appearing in conversations. Nothing was official, but everything was unstable. Peton felt it, even if he didn't yet understand it. By the third day, the illusion of control was gone. Partners hesitated to be seen with him. Invitations disappeared. Lawyers advised silence. The world that once bent around his wealth now paused, recalculated, and pulled back. Not because Bumpy Johnson had threatened violence, but because he had exposed vulnerability. He showed that power without public legitimacy was brittle. Peton never saw Bumpy Johnson during those 72 hours. There were no confrontations, no ultimatums, no warnings. That absence was deliberate, because the most effective pressure is the kind you can't trace back to a single source. The system was doing the work, and it was doing it legally. What Peton learned too late was that the rules had changed. The Civil Rights Act wasn't just a moral statement, it was an economic weapon, and Bumpy Johnson understood how to use it better than the men who thought it only applied to someone else. By the 20th hour, the first signs of collapse appeared. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with silence on the other end of the phone. Loan officers who once smiled politely at Peton's demands now asked questions. Questions about compliance, about risk, about documentation. Each call chipped away at the fortress he thought invincible. Each pause, each delay, felt minor. But together, they were tidal waves. Peton didn't understand what was happening, because power rarely announces itself. Partners who had once followed him without hesitation suddenly became cautious. Meetings were postponed, deals reconsidered, and alliances that had seemed permanent began quietly dissolving. The men and women who built their fortunes alongside him sensed instability, and in the world of high finance, perception is everything. One misstep, one hint that the house of cards could fall, and suddenly everyone wanted distance. Meanwhile, tenants in Peton's buildings began to organize, not because Bumpy ordered them to, but because they felt the shift in power. Bumpy's influence had awakened a confidence that had long been suppressed. Notices were read more carefully, requests handled more seriously. The very people who had once been invisible now exercised agency. And Peyton, trapped by the very structures he thought protected him, could do nothing. Every social connection he had relied on began to fray. Invitations disappeared from calendars. Clubs he once frequented avoided him. The Fifth Avenue world that had applauded his wealth now treated him as if he had become untouchable, but not in the glamorous sense. The touch of society's exclusion was cold, quiet, and relentless. Peyton didn't raise his voice. He didn't call in favors. But the absence of recognition, the withdrawal of subtle support, was more punishing than any shouted insult could have been. By the end of 72 hours, Charles Whitfield Peyton III was a man without leverage, a man whose empire remained intact physically but was collapsing socially and financially. The law, social expectations, and the quiet work of those he underestimated had turned against him. And Bumpy Johnson. He never lifted a hand. He didn't yell, threaten, or appear publicly. He simply understood the systems around him and used them. In that silence, the true power of strategy, patience, and intelligence was revealed. Peyton didn't understand what was happening because power rarely announces itself, and when it moves quietly, decisively, and legally, it leaves devastation in its wake. The same man who thought wealth meant invincibility now learned the hard lesson. Influence is not the same as control, and the rules of engagement had changed forever. By the 22nd hour, Peyton's lawyer finally arrived, briefcase in hand, face pale. Papers were shuffled, documents examined, and then the truth was laid bare. Every demand Peyton had hoped would intimidate, every threat he thought could coerce, had already been countered, legally, methodically, without a single act of aggression. The room was silent except for the careful click of pen on paper. The lawyer spoke quietly but with unmistakable authority. "Consider yourself lucky that Bumpy Johnson chose economics instead of violence." The words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. They carried the weight of inevitability, of power exercised with precision, of a lesson that could not be ignored or negotiated away. Peyton's face betrayed a flicker of understanding, a realization that his arrogance had blinded him, and that his wealth, while still tangible, was powerless in this new equation. No apology was offered, none was accepted. There was no room for bargaining, no space for backpedaling. The law had been used, the system weaponized, and Peyton had nowhere to hide. Each clause, each notice, each calculated step taken in the previous 72 hours came together now. A quiet avalanche, demonstrating that influence and leverage could achieve what guns and threats never could. In that moment, the message was clear. Bumpy Johnson's reach was not measured by fear alone. It was measured by intellect, foresight, and an understanding of power that many assumed required violence. Peyton had learned in the coldest, sharpest way that disrespecting the wrong family, the wrong name, came with consequences, and those consequences could be absolute. The lawyer closed the folder, straightened his tie, and without another word, left the office, leaving Peyton to absorb the reality. He could neither undo what had happened, nor regain the confidence of those who had already witnessed his unraveling. And outside, in the quiet of New York, the city itself seemed to acknowledge the shift, a subtle reminder that power is not always loud, but when wielded wisely, it is unstoppable. Weeks later, May and Ruthie returned to the same Fifth Avenue boutique. The air was different now, charged with a quiet tension. The staff greeted them politely, even deferentially. Whispers that once accompanied their steps were gone, replaced by cautious smiles. Apologies were offered, careful, measured, respect no longer optional. It had been enforced, silently, undeniably. The women shopped with the same elegance, the same calm dignity, but this time the power dynamics had shifted. Every glance they received carried awareness, every gesture a recognition that nothing on that floor could erase what had been set in motion. Bumpy Johnson's reach had extended beyond threats, beyond money. It had rewritten behavior, reshaped the rules, without a single shot fired. Bumpy Johnson didn't break the Cotton Club with bullets. He broke it with leverage. And that doorman, he never knew the insult that changed Harlem. This wasn't just Bumpy's victory. It was proof that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it organizes.